Nine 16-inch barrels pointing at nothing. No target on the horizon, no enemy battleship anywhere in their sights. August 24, 1942, in the waters east of the Solomon Islands. 27 dive bombers are lining up on their target, confident the battleship does not matter. Japanese air crews have received a simple briefing. The carrier Enterprise must go to the bottom. The battleship escorting her is mentioned as an afterthought, a silhouette on the formation's flank, useful only for diversionary fire. Months of combat experience have taught them that American battleships of older construction carry weak, scattered anti-aircraft defenses and can be safely ignored when planning an approach. 8 minutes from now, that calculation will prove so catastrophically wrong that officers on the bridge of Enterprise will signal a question to their escort that ships do not normally ask each other in combat. Are you on fire? But to understand where that question came from, the story has to go back 5 years, to a drafting table where no one was thinking about any aircraft carrier at all. One treaty, one restriction, one loophole left open in case the other side refused to honor the agreement. In 1936, the Second London Naval Treaty set a ceiling. No new capital ship gun could exceed 14 inches in caliber. American negotiators secured the inclusion of an escalator clause, permitting an increase to 16 inches if Japan or Italy refused to sign. No one seriously expected the clause would ever be invoked. Designers at the General Board of the Navy spent nearly a year working on a hull built specifically around 14-inch turrets, calculating armor weight distribution, barbette widths, and belt inclination angles, all for one specific caliber of shell. On March 27, 1937, Japan officially refused to sign. The United States immediately invoked the escalator clause. A ship whose keel had been laid down for 12 14-inch guns in quadruple turrets now had to be redesigned, mid-construction, to carry 9 16-inch guns in triple mounts. Barbettes had to be widened, magazines recalculated from scratch, and the armor belt remained rated to protect against the very caliber that the escalator clause was supposed to have rendered obsolete. This is where the first layer of the paradox is born, the one that will follow this ship through the entire war. The battleship that would become North Carolina was designed first and foremost as a tool for one specific task: a decisive gun battle, line against line, the engagement that interwar naval doctrine regarded as the inevitable conclusion of any major sea war. Her armor was calculated to absorb the blow of an enemy battleship. Her guns were calculated to punch through the armor of an enemy battleship. Every strand of design thinking in 1937 flowed from a single assumption: the next war would be decided by the guns of one capital ship against the guns of another. On April 9, 1941, 8 months before Pearl Harbor, North Carolina entered the fleet as the first new American battleship in nearly 2 decades. But the celebration was brief, because the ship had a problem that no amount of ceremony could hide. During speed trials, the interaction between her propellers and her hull produced a violent longitudinal vibration at certain speeds. The shaking ran through the entire structure, rattling equipment, loosening fittings, and making the ship difficult to operate as intended. The Navy sent her back to the yard for new propellers. She went out again, hit the same speeds, and the vibration returned. Different blade configurations were tested, 4-bladed designs and cut-down versions of the original 3-bladed screws, each requiring another trip out of New York Harbor and back. North Carolina became a familiar sight along the waterfront, sliding past the city on another trial run, then turning around for more work. Crowds started gathering just to watch her pass. They recognized the silhouette by now. Radio broadcaster Walter Winchell, covering one of these departures, linked the ship's repeated appearances to a popular Broadway musical and called her Showboat. The name stuck, and it would follow the ship for the rest of her life. Eventually, the vibration was reduced enough for the Navy to accept the vessel, though it was never fully eliminated. By then, the war in Europe was already underway, and the fleet needed the ship more than it needed the ship to be perfect. Her first combat assignment had nothing to do with the Pacific Ocean. In April 1942, she was sent to the waters off Newfoundland to block a possible breakout by the German battleship Tirpitz into the North Atlantic shipping lanes. Tirpitz never left Norway. North Carolina, after standing watch for a battle that never came, was almost immediately redeployed to the Pacific, where an entirely different war was waiting. By mid-June 1942, the battleship transited the Panama Canal alongside the carriers Wasp and Long Island. When she arrived at Pearl Harbor on July 11th, the mood on the base changed. The fleet was still living in the shadow of December 7th, a harbor full of sunken and damaged ships, crews who had watched friends die at anchor, and a pervasive sense that the Navy was absorbing blows rather than delivering them. For those who remained, North Carolina was the first visible proof that the shipyards back home were sending new steel. Sailors on nearby ships stopped what they were doing to watch her come alongside. Men on the docks cheered. One of North Carolina's crewmen later admitted the reception felt strange because they had not done anything yet. They had not fired a single shot in combat. They had spent months chasing a German battleship that never appeared and running sea trials that uncovered a vibration they could not fix. The crew promised themselves they would earn the welcome soon enough, and within weeks, the opportunity arrived. For the first time in her career, the primary mission was not to form a battle line against an equal opponent, but to stay close to an aircraft carrier and shield it from above. No one at the drafting table in 1937 had designed this as the ship's main function. The anti-aircraft battery, 25-inch dual-purpose guns, and 16 barrels of 1.1-inch guns had been installed as the battleship's own defense against an incidental air attack, not as the principal instrument of war. By August 1942, the battleship had been attached to the task force screening the carrier Enterprise off Guadalcanal. Marines had already landed on the island on August 7th. The Japanese fleet was preparing a counterstrike. The task force cruised south of the Solomons, covering supply lines, and the battleship's crew, apart from a few brushes with shore batteries, had not yet seen real combat. On August 24th, air reconnaissance on both sides found each other. American aircraft struck first and sank the light Japanese carrier Ryujo. The response came quickly. Dive bombers and torpedo planes, escorted by fighters, turned toward Enterprise. North Carolina took her screening position. Gun crews manned their stations. None of them knew yet that in 8 minutes, the sheer volume of their own fire would make the neighboring ship wonder whether their battleship was burning. At 11:25 local time, the task force radar picked up contacts. Multiple targets, bearing 320, 88 miles out. Enterprise and North Carolina were steaming 10 miles apart, the carrier ahead, the battleship behind and slightly to starboard. Around them sailed the heavy cruiser Portland, the light cruiser Atlanta, and 6 destroyers. 54 Wildcat fighters circled overhead at staggered altitudes. 40 minutes remained before the first dive. In those 40 minutes, the Japanese strike group, 27 Aichi Val dive bombers, and 10 Zero escorts lost several aircraft in clashes with the Wildcats at 20,000 feet. But the remaining machines broke through the fighter screen, and at 12:06 they began their runs on Enterprise. The first bomber rolled over into its dive from 20,000 feet. Marine Sergeant Joseph Schinka, commanding the 4th 20mm battery on Enterprise, opened fire even though the targets were still well beyond his effective range. The tracers, stretching skyward from the carrier, became a reference point. Within seconds, every caliber joined in. 20mm, 1.1-inch, 5-inch, from Enterprise, from Portland, from Atlanta, from the destroyers, and from North Carolina. What separated the battleship from every other ship in the formation requires a moment to understand. North Carolina carried 25-inch dual-purpose guns, rapid-firing weapons capable of engaging both surface and air targets, more than any other vessel in the task group. Added to those were 16 barrels of 1.1-inch guns in quadruple mounts and dozens of 20mm Oerlikon automatic cannons. For a battleship designed in 1937 around a main battery duel, this anti-aircraft fit was secondary. Self-defense against an incidental air raid, not the ship's reason for existing. In the doctrine that built her, the air threat was not the priority. Anti-aircraft crews were not the ship's elite. The elite manned the main battery turrets and their 9 16-inch guns. On August 24, 1942, that secondary battery became the primary weapon. The dive bombers came in at roughly 7-second intervals, 5 or 6 aircraft in their dives simultaneously, while others climbed for another pass or pulled away at low altitude after releasing. Enterprise maneuvered with surprising agility for her size, dodging bombs. The first direct hit struck the after end of the flight deck and killed 35 men instantly, including the crew of the after starboard 5-inch battery. Propellant charges in the gun sponson detonated from the impact, and 10 of the dead were never identified. The second hit landed 15 feet closer to the stern. A third bomb, defective, punched through the flight deck near the number 2 elevator and detonated at reduced yield, but still tore a 10-foot hole and put the elevator out of action. Enterprise was burning, listing, and making 27 knots. Damage control parties fought fires, pulled wounded from shattered decks, and vented explosive fumes from compartments below. The surviving guns returned to firing, but several of the attacking dive bombers never reached Enterprise at all. 4 or 5 aircraft from the first wave broke away from the carrier and turned toward the battleship instead. The reason was simple. The volume of fire coming from North Carolina was so dense that the bridge watch on Enterprise concluded the battleship was on fire. The smoke from the propellant gases of 25-inch guns, firing simultaneously, was visually indistinguishable from fire damage at a distance of several miles. Officers on the carrier's bridge signaled a question by lamp that is not normally asked of an escort ship in the middle of a battle. "Are you afire?" North Carolina was not on fire. She was shooting. In 8 minutes of combat, the battleship's anti-aircraft battery shot down between 7 and 14 Japanese aircraft, depending on the assessment. 7 near-miss bomb detonations shook the hull, and gun crews stayed at their stations through every concussion. 1 man died, George Conlon, aviation machinist's mate, 3rd class, hit by a strafing run from a Japanese aircraft passing at low altitude along the starboard side. In the diary of Seaman Mike Marco, who was standing nearby, the entry reads that the bullet went through Conlon's life jacket, through his body, and out the other side of the jacket. Marco described how the wounded man was given morphine and plasma, but Conlon died within minutes. "Good-looking fellow," Marco wrote. "Just married a beautiful girl right before we left Fresno." 1 man killed, 7 near misses, no direct hits, and between 7 and 14 enemy aircraft destroyed. On Enterprise, in those same 8 minutes, 78 men were killed and 90 wounded, more than the carrier had lost in all the previous 9 months of the war combined. 3 bombs struck home. The flight deck was holed in 3 places. The after elevator was wrecked, and steering jammed temporarily. Japanese naval aviation attacked the carrier as the primary target and treated the battleship as a secondary threat, a screening vessel, a fallback for pilots who could not line up on the carrier. Of the 27 dive bombers that launched from the decks of Shokaku and Zuikaku, 9 returned. 18 were lost, along with 6 escort fighters. Japanese aircrew losses from a single sortie proved irreplaceable. Zuikaku lost her entire dive bomber squadron. Trained carrier pilots to fill the gap simply did not exist by August 1942. Midway had taken most of them 2 months earlier. The carrier survived. Enterprise patched the holes in her flight deck within an hour and began recovering aircraft again. North Carolina, having served as the anti-aircraft umbrella, emerged from the battle without a scratch on her hull beyond splinter marks from near misses. A battleship built to shoot at battleships had not fired a single round from her main battery at a surface target during the entire engagement. Her 16-inch guns stayed silent. The war was being won by the secondary battery. 3 weeks later, the ship was tested from a different direction entirely. On September 15, 1942, North Carolina was steaming as part of Task Force 17, now screening the carrier Saratoga in place of the damaged Enterprise. Task Force 18, with the carrier Wasp, steamed on a parallel course several miles to the south. Both formations were heading west, zigzagging on a standard anti-submarine pattern. Visibility was roughly 20,000 yards, with a moderate sea and whitecaps. The Japanese submarine I-19, under the command of Takaichi Kinashi, fired a spread of 6 torpedoes at the carrier Wasp. 2 or 3 struck, and Wasp caught fire so severely that the blaze could not be controlled. The carrier was abandoned and scuttled by her own destroyers. But the remaining torpedoes from the spread, having passed beyond Wasp, continued running. They crossed 5 nautical miles of open water, a distance at which no one expected a hit from a spread aimed at a different target, and entered the formation of Task Force 17. One struck the destroyer O'Brien. Another hit North Carolina. The torpedo struck the battleship's port side 20 feet below the waterline, abreast of the first main battery turret, and tore a hole 32 feet long by 18 feet wide. 5 men were killed, and the ship took a 5.5-degree list to port before counterflooding teams corrected it within 6 minutes. North Carolina increased speed from 19 to 25 knots and held formation for another 5 hours. This is where the design compromise built into the ship at the drafting table in 1937 was laid bare. The hull of the North Carolina class had been made long and narrow for speed, 28 knots by design, fast enough to escort carriers, but not quite fast enough to prevent Enterprise from pulling away during high-speed maneuvers. Her beam was limited by the dimensions of the Panama Canal. The result? The torpedo defense system in the area of the forward turrets was thinner than amidships. Where the midship section had 5 bulkheads between the outer hull and the interior compartments, the area near the first turret had 1 fewer. The torpedo hit exactly that zone. Bulkhead number 1 was destroyed completely, no trace of it remaining between frames 46 and 50. Bulkheads 3 and 4 were driven inward as a single block, their vertical seams torn open. The armored holding bulkhead, number 5, the last line of defense, held back the main rush of water, but the riveted seams parted enough to let water seep through. Flooding was manageable, but the fact that the torpedo had nearly penetrated the final barrier forced the Bureau of Ships to evaluate whether blisters, external bulges added to the hull, should be installed to reinforce the underwater protection. North Carolina withdrew first to Tongatabu, where the repair ship Vestal cut away the bent hull plates and fitted a temporary cofferdam, then to Pearl Harbor for full repairs. It was during this repair period that the ship's anti-aircraft battery was rebuilt from the ground up. The 16 unreliable 1.1-inch barrels, the so-called Chicago pianos, that had jammed during the battle off the Eastern Solomons, were removed. In their place went 40 Bofors barrels of 40mm caliber in 10 quadruple mounts and 46 20mm Ehrlichen autocannons in single mounts. By June 1943, 4 more quadruple Bofors mounts were added. By November, 1 more was installed directly on the roof of the after main battery turret, bringing the total number of 40mm barrels to 60. By the end of the war, the battleship carried 60 Bofors barrels and roughly 36 Oerlikon barrels, more anti-aircraft guns than any other American battleship afloat. A ship designed around 9 16-inch main battery guns as its defining feature was steadily becoming a floating anti-aircraft platform whose principal value to the fleet lay not in its ability to destroy an enemy battleship, but in its ability to prevent enemy aircraft from destroying a friendly carrier. Those 9 16-inch guns never fired at an enemy warship of their own class during the entire war. If subscribing to this channel means you will not miss the next story like this one, the button is right there. You will be back in a minute. But while the anti-aircraft battery was adding barrels, the 16-inch guns did find work after all. Just not the work they were designed for. In November 1943, North Carolina sailed from Pearl Harbor as part of the Northern Covering Group, alongside Enterprise, the battleships Massachusetts and Indiana, 2 light carriers, and 6 destroyers. The objective was the Gilbert Islands, Makin, Tarawa, Abemama. This was the first large-scale amphibious operation of the Central Pacific Offensive, and it was the first time the Marines confronted what it meant to assault a fortified coral atoll. Batio, the main island of Tarawa Atoll, was a strip of coral sand less than 2 miles long. The Japanese garrison of more than 2,500 men had built concrete bunkers, dug gun positions into the coral, and blocked the approaches with steel obstacles. Carrier aircraft could crater the runway and set supply dumps ablaze, but they could not linger over the atoll long enough to crack the bunkers one by one. That job required naval guns, heavy, methodical, capable of walking salvos across a fixed position. North Carolina screened the carriers during 10 days of airstrikes on the islands. On December 8th, she was reassigned to a bombardment group of 5 battleships for the shelling of Nauru. 9 16-inch guns, designed to penetrate the armor of an enemy capital ship at ranges exceeding 20,000 yards, fired instead at airfields, beach defense revetments, and radio installations. Each shell, weighing 2,700 pounds, arriving on a high arc, threw up a column of coral debris and smoke tens of meters high. Spotters aboard Kingfisher floatplanes, catapulted from the battleship's stern, circled above the target and radioed corrections. This was the same battery that had stayed silent during the air battle over the Eastern Solomons. The same barrels. The same crews of nearly 600 men across 3 turrets. The work they had been designed for, gunnery against a major target, was finally happening. Only the target was not an enemy warship. It was a coral island. In January 1944, the offensive reached the Marshall Islands. Off the atoll of Roy Namur, North Carolina opened her bombardment before sunset and continued firing through the night. Fires set by her shells became aiming references. The gun crews used the burning supply dumps as registration points, keeping their salvos inside the belt of defensive positions rather than drifting into empty coral. In the lagoon at Roy, the battleship was credited with sinking a Japanese cargo vessel. A month later, the advance reached Truk, the largest Japanese base in the Central Pacific. Truk Lagoon had served for years as a staging point for the Japanese fleet. Warships, transports, fuel depots, and airfields were concentrated on the islands ringing the lagoon. As long as the base remained intact, it threatened every step of the American push westward. The operation to destroy it was codenamed Hailstone. Carrier aircraft led the attack. More than 500 planes lifted off before dawn on February 17th and flew toward the lagoon. North Carolina steamed on the perimeter of the task force, guarding the ships from which the strike waves launched. Her radar teams swept continuously for any aircraft climbing out of Truk to hit the carriers. When Japanese ships tried to escape the lagoon, carrier planes caught them in open water. By the end of the 2-day raid, roughly 40 Japanese vessels had been sunk, including the cruiser Katori. More than 200 aircraft were destroyed. Approximately 250,000 tons of shipping burned or lay on the bottom of the lagoon. Truk ceased to be capable of supporting major fleet operations. North Carolina shot down another Japanese aircraft during a second raid on Truk in late April. 2 of her Kingfisher floatplanes were catapulted to rescue a downed American pilot near the reef. The first Kingfisher capsized on landing. The second picked up the crew of the first and the pilot, but could not take off with the additional weight. The submarine Tang rescued all 3. On May 1st, North Carolina joined 6 other battleships in a bombardment of Pohnpei, destroying coastal defense guns, anti-aircraft batteries, and damaging the island's airfield. Across all of those months, the same pattern repeated itself. The main battery fired at shore targets, airfields, bunkers, supply depots, but never at an enemy warship. The anti-aircraft battery fired at aircraft. Both batteries were working, but each one was engaging targets it had never been designed for. The culmination of that evolution came in June 1944, off the Mariana Islands. On June 15th, Marines landed on Saipan, the first blow against Japan's inner defensive perimeter. North Carolina covered the landings and shelled the harbor at Tanapag, sinking several small craft and destroying ammunition and supply dumps. That same day, a Japanese air counterattack was intercepted by combat air patrol fighters, and only 2 aircraft from the entire wave broke through the screen. North Carolina shot down one of those 2. The Saipan landings provoked exactly what Japanese command had been preparing: a decisive counterstrike by the full carrier striking force, the first mobile fleet. Japanese carriers approached from the west, and Task Force 58 moved to meet them. On June 19th and 20th, 1944, the battle that American pilots would afterward call the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot was fought. The Battle of the Philippine Sea. Over 2 days, American carrier aircraft and the anti-aircraft fire of ships like North Carolina destroyed what remained of Japanese naval aviation. 3 carriers sunk. 2 fleet oilers damaged so severely that their own crews scuttled them. Of the 430 aircraft with which the Japanese fleet entered the battle, 35 survived. The loss of trained pilots was irreplaceable, but so was the loss of the trained aircraft maintenance crews aboard the carriers, the men without whom planes could neither be serviced nor launched. Not a single American ship was sunk. Only a handful of American aircraft failed to return to their carriers. A battleship designed for one decisive line engagement served through the entire war without ever meeting an equal opponent in a gunnery duel. Her sister ship Washington sank the Japanese battleship Kirishima off Guadalcanal in November 1942, the only battleship versus battleship action in the history of the class. North Carolina was in Pearl Harbor at the time, undergoing repairs from the torpedo hit. Instead, North Carolina earned 15 battle stars, more than any other American battleship in the Second World War, and she earned them with the weapon her designers had considered secondary. By December 1944, North Carolina was screening carriers in support of the invasion of the Philippines. On December 15th, the fleet covered the landings on Mindoro. 3 days later, Task Force 38, 7 fleet carriers, 6 light carriers, 8 battleships, 15 cruisers, and roughly 50 destroyers moved to refuel in open water 300 miles east of Luzon. The barometer began to fall. Wind picked up. The fleet's meteorological service misread the track of the approaching storm, and Admiral Halsey, relying on the forecast, continued maneuvering for refueling instead of withdrawing the fleet. On December 17th, the Third Fleet sailed directly into the center of Typhoon Cobra. Wind gusts exceeded 100 knots. Waves rose in walls, turning the ocean into alternating ridges and troughs. Ships that had been steaming in combat formation scattered across 3,000 square miles of open sea. Aboard the light carrier Monterey, aircraft in the hangar bay tore loose from their tie-downs and slammed into each other, starting a fire that nearly forced the crew to abandon ship. Among those who fought the blaze was a young officer named Gerald Ford, who would become President of the United States 3 decades later. On the decks of North Carolina, 20-millimeter gun shields were bent by the pressure of wind and water. Unsecured equipment slid and crashed across the decks. The bow climbed each swell and dropped hard enough to shudder through the entire hull. The ship rolled past 30 degrees, a 35,000-ton battleship swinging on her beam like a fishing trawler. 3 destroyers did not survive the storm. Hull capsized after a gust of 110 knots pinned her on her beam ends, and water flooded down her funnel and into the pilot house. 202 men drowned, 62 survived. Monahan, a veteran of Pearl Harbor that had rammed and sunk a Japanese midget submarine on December 7, 1941, rolled over and went to the bottom with 256 of her crew. 6 survived. Spence, her rudder jammed hard to starboard, lay on her side and sank, taking 317 men with her. 23 were pulled from the water. 790 men died from the storm. 146 aircraft were destroyed or swept overboard. 27 ships suffered damage, 11 of them severe. Admiral Nimitz later observed that the Typhoon had inflicted a blow on the Third Fleet comparable to a major sea battle. North Carolina came through the storm intact and under her own power. When the seas subsided, the scattered ships began to regroup, sweeping the swells for life rafts and survivors. With Ulithi Atoll now serving as the fleet's forward operating base, North Carolina screened carrier strikes that ranged across the western Pacific in January 1945. Formosa, the coast of French Indochina, the Chinese coast, and the Ryukyu island chain all received strikes designed to destroy Japanese aircraft on the ground before they could interfere with the next invasion. Hundreds of enemy planes were wrecked on their airstrips, never reaching the air. And for the crews of the carriers those strikes cleared, the battleship's anti-aircraft umbrella was the insurance policy that allowed pilots to launch and recover without interruption. In February, the target shifted to Iwo Jima, a volcanic island 8 miles square that lay almost exactly halfway between the Marianas and the Japanese home islands. The island's value was simple. It held 2 airfields that Japanese fighters were using to intercept American bombers on their way to Tokyo. And if captured, those same airfields could serve as emergency landing strips for crippled bombers returning from raids. The garrison, roughly 21,000 troops under Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, had spent months tunneling into the volcanic rock, connecting bunkers and gun positions with a network of underground passages that made them nearly impervious to bombardment from the air. North Carolina joined the pre-invasion bombardment force. For several days before the Marines went ashore on February 19th, her 16-inch guns hammered positions along the beaches and inland slopes. Call fire missions followed the Marines as they pushed inland, the ship adjusting her salvos in response to radioed coordinates from spotters on the ground. The main battery that had never fired at an enemy warship was being used, once again, as a siege weapon, reducing fortifications that had been designed to withstand exactly this kind of punishment. Kuribayashi's defense in depth absorbed the bombardment and kept fighting, and the battle for Iwo Jima would grind on for over a month, killing nearly 7,000 Marines and wounding another 20,000. North Carolina's guns could crack open concrete from 15 miles offshore, but they could not reach into the tunnels where the garrison waited. After Iwo Jima, strikes on targets in the Japanese home islands followed, laying the groundwork for the operation that would bring the war to its final stage, Okinawa. North Carolina played her dual role throughout, bombardment and carrier screening, and by late March, she was operating off the island itself. In 3 years of war, the 16-inch guns had not fired a single round at an enemy warship. Not once, across every campaign from the Solomons to within sight of Japan. On April 6, 1945, that role reached its limit. Task Group 58.2, 3 fleet carriers, 2 light carriers, 3 battleships, 4 light cruisers, and 12 destroyers, was stationed off the coast of Okinawa. Marines had landed on the island on April 1st, and Japanese command was preparing a response that the American fleet expected, but could never grow accustomed to. Operation Kikusui, Floating Chrysanthemum, launched the first of 10 massed kamikaze strikes. Over the course of April 6th, Japanese aviation threw more than 700 aircraft at the American fleet. Combat air patrol fighters intercepted roughly 200. Shipboard anti-aircraft fire destroyed another 200, and the remaining 180 broke through to the ships. The kamikaze pilots, most of them cadets with minimal flight hours, had been trained to do 2 things: take off and dive. Navigation, formation flying, and evasive maneuvering were not part of the curriculum, because none of those skills were needed for a one-way flight. Each pilot carried enough fuel to reach the fleet, and an instruction sheet that read, in essence, "Attack the first ship you see." The radar picket destroyers bore the worst of it. These ships, stationed in pairs on the outer approaches to the formation at distances of 15 to 75 miles from the main body, were the first targets the kamikazes encountered. Their job was to provide early radar warning and direct combat air patrol fighters to intercept incoming raids, but on April 6th, the sheer number of aircraft overwhelmed both the fighters and the destroyers themselves. The destroyer Bush took 3 kamikaze hits in succession and sank. The destroyer Colhoun, steaming to assist Bush, was struck and sank herself. The high-speed minesweeper Emmons absorbed 5 separate kamikaze impacts and was scuttled by her surviving crew. 5 aircraft slammed into Nukem, one after another, within a span of minutes, and the fifth, bouncing off Nukem's superstructure, caromed into the side of Leutze, which had pulled alongside to pass fire hoses. North Carolina shot down 3 kamikazes that day. 60 Bofors barrels and dozens of Oerlikon autocannons fired continuously, their crews shifting from target to target in a chaos where the direction of attack changed every few seconds. Shortly after 1 in the afternoon, an Allied destroyer, which one was never established in the official record, fired at a low-flying kamikaze and missed. The 5-inch shell continued its trajectory and struck the base of the Fire Control Director Sky 2 on North Carolina's port side, directly above the signal bridge. Edward Emil Brenn, fire controlman, was killed instantly. Carl Elmer Karam Jr., Seaman First Class, was killed. John Malcolm Watson, fire controlman First Class, was killed. 44 men were wounded. Fire Controlman Third Class Jerry Cass wrote in his diary that evening, "3 of my shipmates were killed today, and I knew them all. Strange feeling. It seems like I will wake up tomorrow and find out it's a dream. I was standing on the signal bridge when it happened. A 5-inch shell hit Sky 2 at the base, fired by our own destroyer. I could hear the shrapnel hitting the steel around me. I hope I never see another day like this." On the Director Sky 2, where Brenn and Watson died, the repair welds are still visible today on the museum ship in Wilmington, on the same bridge where Cass was standing. The next day, April 7th, the Japanese fleet committed its final gamble. The battleship Yamato, the largest warship ever built, 72,000 tons at full load, armed with 9 18-inch guns whose shells weighed over 3,200 pounds each, sortied from Sasebo with the light cruiser Yahagi and 8 destroyers, carrying only enough fuel for a one-way voyage. The mission was straightforward: break through to Okinawa, beach the ship, and fire on the invasion force until destroyed. The irony of the sortie belongs to this story because Yamato represented everything North Carolina was supposed to fight and never did. Yamato was the ultimate expression of the same doctrine, the decisive line-against-line gunnery engagement that had shaped North Carolina's design on the drafting table in 1937. Both ships existed because their designers believed the next war would be settled by the heaviest guns on the largest hulls. Yamato's guns were the heaviest, her armor was the thickest, and on April 7, 1945, she was sunk without ever closing to gunnery range of an enemy capital ship, destroyed by 386 carrier aircraft launched from the decks of ships that North Carolina and battleships like her had been protecting for 3 years. Carrier aircraft sank the battleship, the cruiser, and 4 destroyers long before they reached Okinawa. The remaining 4 destroyers turned back, badly damaged. North Carolina shot down 1 more Japanese bomber during this action. The age of the battleship duel ended that afternoon in the East China Sea. The gun battle that North Carolina was built to fight had been rendered obsolete by the very weapon system she had spent the war defending. On April 17th, 2 more kamikazes fell to the ship's guns. Then came an overhaul at Pearl Harbor, where the damage from the friendly fire hit was repaired, and the anti-aircraft battery received its final additions. North Carolina returned to the fleet in late June and rejoined the carriers for a last month of strikes against the Japanese home islands, the industrial heartland that the entire 3-year advance across the Pacific had been fought to reach. Along with screening the carriers, North Carolina turned her 16-inch guns on major industrial plants near Tokyo during the fleet's bombardment of Honshu, the first and only time her main battery fired at targets on the Japanese mainland. The ship's Kingfisher floatplanes were catapulted for reconnaissance and rescue missions during these final weeks. In one of the last actions of the war, a Kingfisher pilot from North Carolina landed in Tokyo Bay under fire from shore batteries to pick up a downed American carrier pilot, pulled the man aboard, and taxied across the water to safety while Japanese guns splashed rounds around the slow-moving floatplane. On August 15th, Japan announced its surrender. North Carolina sent sailors and members of her Marine detachment ashore for preliminary occupation duty, then patrolled off the coast until anchoring in Tokyo Bay on September 5th. The ship that had been designed to destroy the Japanese fleet in a decisive gun battle was now sitting peacefully in the enemy's home waters, her guns silent, her war over. Time to count. Out of 144 officers and 2,195 enlisted men who served aboard the ship during the war, 10 were killed. 67 were wounded. 15 battle stars earned. Participation in every major offensive operation of the Pacific Fleet from Guadalcanal to Tokyo Bay. Not a single day out of service except for torpedo repairs and anti-aircraft upgrades. 10 men lost in the entire war, out of a crew of over 2,000. On Enterprise, 78 died in a single battle at the Eastern Solomons. On Wasp, every man who did not make it off the ship on September 15th. On the radar picket destroyers at Okinawa, dozens per ship. On the 3 destroyers sunk by Typhoon Cobra, 775. This is the second facet of the paradox that defines the entire story of North Carolina. A battleship designed to absorb the blow of an enemy battleship served 3 years in a role her designers considered secondary and lost 10 men. 5 to a Japanese torpedo that struck the thinnest section of her own underwater defense. 1 to a Japanese machine gunner at the Eastern Solomons. 3 to a shell from an Allied destroyer, and 1 in scattered engagements in the war's final months. The 9 16-inch guns, the main battery, the weapon for which the ship was designed, for which treaties were negotiated and escalator clauses invoked, never fired at an enemy warship of equal class. The secondary battery, installed for self-defense, served as the defining weapon of the entire career. This was not a ship built for the wrong war. This was a ship built for a war that found her a better purpose than the one her designers had imagined. On June 27, 1947, North Carolina was decommissioned and placed in the reserve fleet at Bayonne, New Jersey. For 13 years she sat at the pier, rusting, losing paint, becoming a steel structure without a crew or a mission. On June 1, 1960, she was struck from the Naval Vessel Register. The next step was sail for scrapping. In Wilmington, North Carolina, a newspaper editor named James Craig opened the morning edition of the Wilmington Morning Star and read a short item about the ship's impending demolition. Craig had not served in the Navy. He was an Army veteran, but he remembered that the ship bearing his state's name had earned more battle stars than any other battleship, and that 10,000 North Carolinians had died in the Second World War, regardless of branch. He had recently visited Houston and seen the battleship Texas preserved as a memorial. He decided that North Carolina deserved the same. Craig approached the local chapter of the American Legion and proposed a campaign to save the ship. The idea was simple. Each of the state's 100 counties would appoint an admiral, a person responsible for fundraising in that county. Anyone who donated $100 would also receive the rank of admiral, a certificate, and free lifetime admission to the ship. The governor suggested involving the schools. Every child who brought a dime would receive a free ticket. The campaign was called Save Our Ship. Of the state's 1,100,000 schoolchildren, 700,000 brought their dimes. Glass jars sat in classrooms, slowly filling with coins. Schools that met their quota were listed on a plaque that would eventually be mounted inside the ship. The total exceeded $330,000, roughly $2.5 million in today's money. On September 25, 1961, North Carolina left Bayonne for the last time. The ship had no power of her own, her boilers cold, her turbines locked. 9 ocean tugs took her under tow, and the convoy moved south along the Atlantic coast, past the skyline of New York, past the beaches of New Jersey, down through the capes of Virginia and the outer banks of her namesake state. The passage took a week. Along the route, small boats came out to watch her pass, and at several points the procession slowed to navigate channels that the battleship's 35,000-ton draft made tight. On October 2nd, the ship entered the mouth of the Cape Fear River at the town of Southport. The next day, tugs eased her 30 miles upstream through the winding channel to a berth on Eagles Island, directly across the river from downtown Wilmington, where a concrete pad and mooring dolphins had been prepared to hold her permanently. On October 14, 1961, the ship opened to the public for the first time. More than 5,000 people walked her decks on the first day. On the signal bridge, at the base of the Director's Sky 2, the repair welds from the friendly fire hit were still clearly visible. On the same day, October 14th, in San Antonio, Texas, James Craig died. The man who organized the rescue of the ship did not see it open. He knew the ship had arrived. That had happened 2 weeks earlier. But he never walked aboard, never passed the glass jar of dimes now displayed behind exhibition glass. Inside the ship, in the compartment dedicated to the Save Our Ship campaign, a plaque lists the names of 2,400 admirals and the schools that met their quotas. On a separate wall hangs a photograph of Craig and a few lines about what he did. Today, North Carolina sits on the Cape Fear River on 55 acres of Eagles Island and receives roughly 200,000 visitors a year. You can descend into the engine room, climb inside a main battery turret, and walk up to the navigation bridge. You can touch the repair welds on the Director's Sky 2. You can see the glass jar of dimes and read Craig's name. A battleship designed for one war and served in another. An anti-aircraft battery conceived as secondary and became the primary weapon. A main battery that never fired at an equal opponent. 10 men killed in the entire war out of a crew of 2,000, 3 of them by an Allied shell. 700,000 children who gave a dime each so the ship would not become razor blades. And 1 man who died on the day his work was finished. If this story was worth your time, subscribing means the next one will find you on its own.